The film grain shudders. A black and white photograph fades in a dirt road curling between pine trees so tall they blot out the sky. The wind is soundless, the leaves are still, there is no movement, no bird call, no trace of life. Between 1891 and 1918, 97 men, women, and children vanished inside a remote Appalachian settlement known only in old survey maps as Ashford Hollow. No bodies were ever found. No suspects were ever arrested. No news reports survived beyond a handful of smudged, water-damaged clippings buried in county archives. Locals refused to speak about it, except in whispers after church, when the preacher had gone home and the lamps were low. Some said the mountains swallowed them whole, that the land itself was hungry. Others, bolder in drink than in daylight, claimed there was something older than God living in those trees, and that it took people slowly, deliberately, as if savoring each absence. Official records show that every missing person was last seen within a 2-mile radius of the settlement's church, a clapboard building with no bell, no cross, and no windows. When a photographer from Charleston came in 1904 to document the area, the townspeople surrounded his wagon and demanded he leave before sundown. He did, but his assistant, a young man named Michael Wren, did not, and his disappearance became number 32. The settlement no longer exists on modern maps. The government calls it uninhabitable land due to a supposed landslide in 1922. But if you walk far enough into the pines, past where the roads rot into dirt, you'll find the stone foundation of that church. And if you listen closely, you'll hear footsteps that are not yours. 1891. The first recorded disappearance was of Sarah Calloway, a schoolteacher from a neighboring valley. She'd been hired to teach the settlement's 6 children, but on her second week, she never returned from her walk to the church. A search party was formed, 20 men with rifles and lanterns. They found her hat at the edge of the pines, its ribbon torn and matted with sap. Nearby, the ground was disturbed not as if from a struggle, but as though something had been dragged into the forest. When the men followed the trail, they claimed it ended abruptly in a patch of earth too soft for winter. One man stepped onto it, and his boots sank up to the ankle in mud that smelled faintly of rust and something sweet, like rotting fruit. That night, the minister told the search party to say nothing, and that Sarah had simply moved on. His sermon the next Sunday was on the sin of curiosity. Within a year, 3 more settlers would disappear, all without explanation, each last seen walking toward the church. The Ashford Hollow church was unlike any in the surrounding counties. There was no bell to call the faithful, no cross to mark it as holy ground, and no windows to let the light in. The walls were blackened pine, older than the settlement itself, and the door was made from a single slab of oak, warped but unnervingly heavy. Inside, the air was always damp, and the floor sloped slightly toward the altar, though no one could explain why. The altar was a simple stone block, worn smooth by decades of hands and knees. In the floor just beneath it was a square of wood darker than the rest, like it had been soaked in something that never fully dried. No hymns were ever sung there. The congregation met in silence, each member sitting with their heads bowed, eyes closed, lips moving soundlessly. Services could last hours. Children were not allowed inside until they turned 13. When an outsider once asked why the church had no windows, an old farmer answered simply, "So nothing in there can see out." In 1895, a county clerk inspecting property taxes for Ashford Hollow stumbled across a ledger in the minister's possession. The book was labeled Orphans, but the entries were strange. Each page listed a child's name, birth date, and in the far column a date of transfer. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, but the ink grew heavier as the years went on, like the pen was being pressed too hard into the page. The first child recorded was Matthew Pike, transferred in 1883, 8 years before Sarah Calloway vanished. The last entry was in 1917, only months before the settlement's final disappearance. There were no notes about where the children went. No adoptive families, no payment records, just the names and the dates and a faint reddish smudge on the edges of the paper, as if the ledger had been handled with stained hands. When the clerk asked the minister about it, the minister smiled faintly and said, "The children are fed." The clerk never returned to Ashford Hollow. Ashford Hollow wasn't a town in the usual sense. It was 5 extended families who had lived there since before the Civil War. They married only within the settlement or with those from one other valley, and no outsider ever stayed long enough to become one of them. The surnames Pike, Mallory, Greaves, Cutter, and Hallow appeared in the county census like stubborn stains. Year after year, the same names, the same faces in photographs, hardly aging between decades. It was whispered in nearby towns that Ashford Hollow was too close-knit. Babies were said to resemble uncles far too closely, and the old people. They were old, but their eyes stayed sharp, their teeth unbroken. One drifter who wintered there in 1901 claimed that on certain nights, the families would gather in the church with their children, carrying baskets covered with cloth. The next morning, he said, the baskets were empty, but the altar smelled strongly of iron and earth. He left before the thaw and became disappearance number 15. In 1908, after a schoolteacher from Charleston vanished while visiting relatives in the area, the state sent 2 deputies to investigate. They never filed a report. Local rumor says the deputies were seen entering the church with the minister one afternoon, then leaving just before sunset. Pale and wordless, they didn't even stop in the next town to eat, just rode straight back to the county seat. 2 weeks later, one of the deputies resigned and moved his family to Ohio. The other was found drowned in the Elk River, his pockets full of smooth black stones. No other officials came to Ashford Hollow after that. By 1912, the disappearances had drawn the attention of a traveling preacher named Isaiah Bell. He claimed the Lord had burdened his spirit to cleanse the place. Bell arrived unannounced, wearing a dust-coated suit and carrying a Bible heavy enough to be a weapon. 2 days, no one spoke to him. On the 3rd, he broke into the church. What he found inside was not written in any surviving account, but he told a farmhand the next morning that the altar could be lifted, and beneath it was a trapdoor of blackened wood, bound with iron hooks. The farmhand asked what was under it. Bell shook his head and whispered, "It's not under. It's through." That night, the preacher left town. His horse was found the next morning, grazing along the road. Bell was never seen again. The winter of 1914 was one of the coldest on record. Snow buried the settlement's roofs, and the road in was impassable for weeks. When a supply wagon finally reached Ashford Hollow in February, the driver found the entire town silent. Doors stood open, fires smoldered unattended in hearths, but the people, all 34 of them, were gone. In the church, the altar had been pushed aside. The trapdoor was open. A thick, wet draft rose from it, smelling of salt water and decay, though there was no ocean within 100 miles. On the altar lay the orphan ledger, open to a blank page. A single word had been scrawled across it in heavy, uneven ink: Fed. 3 weeks later, the townsfolk reappeared as if nothing had happened, though some of them were different. They walked with a stiffness, avoided sunlight, and spoke less. And from that winter onward, disappearances doubled. In 1915, a glass plate photographer named Ernest Vail came through the mountains to document rural life for the state archive. He managed to take only 7 photographs in Ashford Hollow before townsfolk told him to stop. 6 of them were mundane: men at a sawmill, women gutting fish, children carrying pails from the well. But the 7th, it showed the church door slightly ajar, the minister standing in shadow, and behind him, deeper in darkness, something pale and long, limbed, bending at an angle no person could manage. The shape blurred at the edges as if the lens had tried to reject it. Vail claimed he didn't remember taking that photograph. Weeks later, he died in a fire that consumed his home. Every plate was destroyed, except that one, which had been left in a county records office the day before. To this day, the photo has no official label. Archivists simply call it the Hollow. A historian named Margaret Drown began charting the disappearances in 1916. After finding the orphan ledger during a separate tax inquiry, what she discovered was a precise, chilling rhythm. Every 7th disappearance was a child under the age of 13, always on a new moon, always in late winter. The others, the adults, vanished in between these marked dates, as if they were meant to fill the gaps. Drown presented her findings to the county court. 2 days later, she was seen boarding a train to Baltimore. She never arrived. Her luggage was found still waiting on the platform. When her boarding ticket was recovered from the conductor's log, the time of purchase was exactly midnight. On the night of a new moon, in March of 1918, days before the last disappearance, Ashford Hollow was hit by a storm so dense the sky turned black at noon. Travelers from neighboring hills said the clouds didn't roll in, they lowered, like a ceiling pressing down. The air was warm, damp, and carried the sound of low, droning voices. For 3 days, no light touched the settlement. Lamps would not stay lit. Matches burned cold. On the 4th morning, the storm lifted and 31 people were gone. Only the church remained locked. The few who survived claimed that on the 2nd night, the minister led the townsfolk into the church, carrying bundles wrapped in cloth. They entered through the front door, but none were seen leaving. The last living person to leave Ashford Hollow before it vanished was an 8-year-old boy named Evan Pike. In 1932, as an old man, he was interviewed by a WPA writer collecting mountain folklore. When asked about the settlement, Evan began shaking so violently he had to be helped to a chair. Between sobs, he whispered that he'd been hiding under the floorboards of his family's home the night of the storm. He heard the minister calling names, one by one, in a voice that was too many voices at once. When they called his name, he stayed hidden. He heard his mother scream not in fear, but in obedience, as though she'd been waiting her whole life for it. He said the last thing he heard before the church door shut was the sound of water rushing upward. Like the whole mountain was hollow and the sea had come to claim it. Evan refused to speak after that. He died the next winter. By summer 1922, Ashford Hollow had been wiped from all official maps. The federal government declared the land geologically unstable, after what they described as a catastrophic landslide, but no photographs of this landslide exist. No debris was ever documented, no rescue crews deployed. Neighboring valleys reported no tremors, no flooding, no rumble of earth moving. Still, within a month, all deeds were voided and the property was placed under federal control. A tall chain-link fence was erected around a 12-square-mile radius, patrolled by men in uniforms with no insignia. Locals say anyone caught crossing the fence line was escorted out at gunpoint, their film confiscated. One man who tried to sneak in returned barefoot and babbling in language no one recognized, a mix of mountain dialect and something guttural wet. He stopped eating within a week, claiming the hollow's already full, and it's waiting for the next mouth to open. In 1936, during the Great Depression, a team of government surveyors was sent to recharge abandoned mining regions in the Appalachians. Their notes for Ashford Hollow's coordinates are missing from all official records except for one torn page recovered from an estate sale in 1984. The page contains only a crude sketch, the church foundation drawn as a square, and below it, an inverted pyramid descending into the earth. At the bottom of the pyramid, an open circle is marked with a single word, Ma. The handwriting at the margin reads, "No echo here, no depth, just breathing." None of the survey team were ever located after the expedition. From the 1950s onward, the land was quietly reopened, no announcement, no public notice. The fence was gone. Hikers occasionally report finding the church's stone foundation deep in the pines. They describe the air as unnaturally still, their own breathing uncomfortably loud. One group in 1974 claimed they found a square of soil in the center of the foundation that was warm to the touch, even in winter. Beneath it, they swore they heard faint movement like someone shifting in bed far below them. A year later, one of those hikers drowned in his bathtub. Another disappeared during a camping trip, his sleeping bag still zipped closed. The remaining two refused to discuss it. The most recent account came from a pair of brothers hunting deer in 2003. They camped near the ruins, intending to use the open clearing for visibility. That night, they awoke to the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps circling their tent. No light, not moon, not stars reached the clearing. The footsteps stopped directly beside the tent door, and something leaned close enough to cast a long shadow across the fabric. One brother shouted, unzipping the tent, but there was nothing there. When they broke camp at first light, they found prints in the frost, not human, not animal. Long, arched impressions that seemed to pull down into the soil rather than press outward. They swore they heard a single word in stillness before they left, fed. In 2011, a volunteer archivist in Charleston was cataloging materials from a defunct county courthouse when she opened a crate marked simply religious records. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, Was the orphan ledger from Ashford Hollow the same one thought lost since 1918? The ink was faded, but the pages were intact. The names stopped at 1917, but the remaining pages were not blank. In faint pencil under each transfer a date. Someone had written another date, all of them after the official disappearance of the settlement. The last entry was 2009. Archivists tried to trace the names, but most had no birth certificates, no census records, no graves. She didn't come to work the next day. Genealogists studying the 5 Ashford Hollow families noticed something disturbing. Even after the settlement's erasure, descendants scattered across Appalachia still gathered every February during the new moon. These meetings weren't recorded in church bulletins or family diaries, but aerial photos from the 1970s show large groups assembling in isolated clearings, often near old foundations. Oral history from nearby towns hints that these gatherings involved feeding the ground, though no one will say what that means. One elderly woman told an interviewer in 1992, "You think the hollow died? It didn't die. It learned to walk." In 2018, a spelunking group explored a cavern system beneath the old Ashford Hollow coordinates. Deep underground, they found a perfectly smooth shaft leading straight down, the walls slick with black, briny water. Dropping a flare into the shaft, they expected a splash. Instead, they heard a deep, low intake of air, like the sound a diver makes before plunging underwater, but magnified until it shook the rock walls. When they climbed out, their watches were all 6 hours slow. The footage from their helmet cameras cut abruptly the moment the flare left their hands. Some say Ashford Hollow was a place, others believe it was a door. The truth might be worse. A door is passive, but a mouth hungers. The names in the ledger are still being written somewhere. The soil over the church foundation is still warm. The footsteps still circle in the dark. Maybe that's the reason the government never truly destroyed it. Maybe something made an agreement long before the first settlers arrived, an understanding that as long as it was fed, it would stay in the hollow. But a mouth doesn't know the difference between a plate and a hand. When you walk too far into the pines, past where the road turns to dirt, past where your phone loses its signal, you might feel the air grow still and warm. You might hear your name called in a voice that is too many voices at once.